Greetings, YouTube. With the rise of the Tea Party, I hear a lot of talk in America about the phrase small government. And when I hear the phrase small government, I think of one of three things. The first thing I think of is that this person really doesn't like regulations, and they really do like corporate America. Because in many cases, the small government position seems to be that all regulation is bad regulation, which I think makes about as much sense as taxation is theft. And when I hear either of these particular ideas, I pretty much dismiss the person as not being all that serious. Because I freely admit that some regulation is too much regulation. For example, we shouldn't be regulating chemicals that people put in their body willingly. But we should be regulating chemicals that are being put in our bodies that we don't know about. For example, things in our food that we're unaware of, corporations pumping toxins into the air, the water, the land, you have it. So some regulations are bad, and many of them are good, and frankly, we do not have nearly enough regulations on corporate America. We really need to clamp down on them, in particular, the financial sector. So when I think of people who talk about small government, that's the first thing that pops into my mind. I think, why is it that you hate Americans, but you love corporate America? The second thing I think of is tribalism. Human beings are tribal. We function best in tribes, and a tribe is about 150 individuals. There's actually been research done in this particular field. I'm not just making that number up. After 150 people, excuse me, I have a cold, groups tend to get too large. We get uncomfortable. And if a group gets big enough to a certain point, those groups break up into smaller groups until the number is reduced, again, until we feel comfortable. One of the first things any subculture does, of any variety, is break up into smaller subcultures. It's what we do. We are tribal beasts. The problem is that when you have a tribe, it's easier for a tribe to be controlled by an individual or by someone from a distance controlling the person in charge of that tribe. So it's very easy to divide and conquer. It's harder to fool 1,000 people who are all functioning together and hard to control them than if you have 100 people. It's much easier to control 100 people, and it's easier still to control 10 people. So I see tribalism as a tool used by the elite, the financial elite, the people who are at the top, who control our economy, of dividing and conquering, splitting up our nation into smaller and smaller social groups so that they can then control those social groups through politicians and religious leaders and political pundits, demagogues, things like that. So I think that tribalism can be very bad. There are things that are good about tribalism because we like to be considered exclusive. We like the whole I'm a member of the in crowd kind of thing. I understand that. I get it. But it also can mean that it's very easy to spread prejudice and bigotry and hate, things like that, because, again, a smaller group is easier to sway their opinions of and to get people to follow a charismatic leader, which, in my mind, is dangerous. And the last thing I think of, I actually wrote this down, small government can't do big things. For example, I live in the state of New Hampshire. It's a pretty small state. Physically, it's a pretty small state. Population-wise, we don't have a lot of population. A lot of the states, trees. Okay, there's not a lot of population density. Most of it's in the southern part of the state where I live. And if we wanted to put a man on the moon, we couldn't do that. We just couldn't. We would have to take every single person and concentrate every single ounce of their effort to the exclusion of producing enough materials for us to survive to put a man on the moon. And yet the nation of America did it multiple times. There are times when big groups of people can accomplish things that small groups of people can only dream of. And that's one of the reasons that while small governments can be useful on occasion, they're not always the best tool for the task. Now, yes, I admit small governments have advantages. They can react to things in a more dynamic way. They understand things on the ground in a much more intimate manner. I know someone that fished, and one of his things is if you want to catch fish, you buy lures from the guy that lives on the lake, because he knows the lake better than anybody else, because he lives there. By that same token, small governments can react more easily to situations on the ground. But they can also fall prey to the three things I just mentioned. They can't do big things. Tribalism, and often people advocating small government are just trying to shove as much of the public money into the pockets of the wealthy at the cost of damaging the middle class and the poor. So, while I know that there are things about small governments that can be good, I'm not an advocate of the whole small government movement. I want there to be an overarching federal structure, making sure that people aren't screwing the poor and the middle class by taking regulations off of corporate America, by funneling American tax dollars into the pockets of the wealthy, making sure that there are going to be 50 different types of civil rights in America. I want there to be one even, consistent, equal set of rights in America, where everyone is treated the same no matter where you live, where everyone has access to the same types of privileges, responsibilities, and rights. I want women's reproductive health to be the same everywhere. I want to make sure that freedom of speech is the same as everywhere. I want to make sure that there are laws against racism and bigotry and misogyny and everything else that we need to protect the individual from mob rule. Because, folks, the majority is not about mob rule. Democracy is not about the greatest number of votes decide that the minority have no rights. That's not democracy. Those are pitchforks and torches in the night. Those are lynch mobs. Those are burning crosses. That's mob rule. And lastly, small governments can't do big things. And sometimes we need big things. So when I hear the phrase small government, I think of those three negative things long before I ever think about anything that's positive.